Hey everybody, welcome to another episode. I'm happy to help you discover another part of Paris that I think is a pretty special one indeed. We're here at the Chapelle Expiatoire. This is in the 8th arrondissement, not too far from the Saint-Lazare train station, not too far from La Madeleine Church. More on that in a moment. This is a little chapel that is modest in size, but historically very significant. And I'm going to take you inside there and give you a nice thorough look inside and all the details and the stories behind them. Trying to start filming with some sunlight because it's a little bit, the clouds are moving fast today and the sunlight is brief, we'll put it that way. I'll just give you an idea here. There's a little pavilion here to the right side of us. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. As I show you these preliminary views, let me give you a little bit of backstory. Of course, we're all about backstory and history here, so I want to help you understand the extraordinary details behind the construction of this chapel, and then I'll explain exactly what we're looking at here. This spot where we are was previously the cemetery of a nearby church called La Madeleine. Many of you know it, or more specifically, it would have been the previous version of La Madeleine, because there was an earlier iteration of that church here in the 8th arrondissement, and this would have been originally the cemetery for that Madeleine church. Over 500 victims of the guillotine during the French Revolution were buried here, or rather dumped here into mass graves of the cemetery. And the most famous of those victims were certainly King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. They had two children, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, a younger son who died in prison during the Revolution, and then an older daughter named Marie-Thérèse, and I'll ask you to remember that name because she'll come back to us throughout the episode. Marie-Thérèse survived the Revolution, the oldest daughter, and then left in exile during that period for Vienna and other places as well. After the revolutionary fervor settled in Paris, Marie-Thérèse was able to move back here, and the government was much more royal-centric at that time, with a new king, King Louis XVIII, who happened to be the brother of the previous king and the uncle of Marie-Thérèse. So they all came back through. By then, Marie-Thérèse had been married, and so she was referred to as the Duchess of Angoulême. But for today, we'll call her Marie-Thérèse. So she returned, and obviously this, what was the cemetery here, had a lot of sentimental value and significance. In 1815, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette's remains were identified here at the cemetery and exhumed, and there was a big fancy procession to move them to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, which today still is the royal necropolis of all the kings and queens of France, just north of Paris. So those bodies were exhumed after 21 years of the two of them being buried here. But Marie-Thérèse wanted a chapel placed here in honor of her parents, in addition to a convent. And so that's what we're going to visit today, the Chapelle Expiatoire. Her uncle at the time, as I said, the king, who was Louis XVIII, also agreed that there should be a chapel here. So they both helped finance this project, and also both worked very closely, particularly Marie-Thérèse, the daughter, worked very closely with the star architect of this chapel, who was named Pierre Fontaine, who previously was an architect of Napoleon Bonaparte, and then during the Restoration period, which is what we're talking about here. Fontaine was no slouch. He was quite a rock star here. He did work previously on the Louvre and the Palais Royal and Versailles and Fontainebleau and countless other chateaux. Fontaine's design is neoclassical, so this is typically French in the early 1800s here, where rather austere, not too flashy, with Doric columns here that aren't too ornate at all, that's for sure. And the Louis XVIII also wanted, at the time, the monarch wanted something not too flashy to flaunt the royal family, because they had basically just finally come back into good standing generally with the French after a terrible revolution. So Louis was like, well, let's not stuff it down their throats. In fact, if I can zoom in a little bit here in the pediment, if you can see, it's a little dark in there, but you can see even the crucifix itself is very subdued and discreet and very small. So they didn't want to overdo it with the royal symbolism on the outside, nor did they want to overdo it with the Christian symbolism. I guess there's a little crucifix up at the top there as well. So the architect, Fontaine, wanted a chapel that felt protected and isolated. So he designed, essentially standing on an elevated garden. We'll talk about that in a moment. He built these what are called cenotaphs, which are fake tombs in that they're meant to be symbolic. So no remains actually placed in them, but we have, I believe, 9 on each side here, and it creates, as I said, this very insulated, protected sense of a very solemn and quiet space to come pay your respects. And you've got the cenotaphs over there as well. Again, symbolic tombs, but not actually containing any remains, and they continue here. You see what is very common in cemeteries and tombs. You'll see this at Père Lachaise, which is the symbol of the hourglass with wings, and that quite simply just represents how time flies, the fleeting nature of time, and specifically our time on Earth. So that is a common motif. And then not so common is what you see here, almost garlands of sorts here. These are branches of cypress trees. Cypress trees represent mourning, the mourning of the dead. And so maybe we'll zoom in a little bit more. You can see the leaves of the cypress trees and the branches and whatnot. Long ago, there were lots of cypress trees planted here around the chapel, but they were removed under the Haussmann renovations. And then what we've also got here are some pretty standard funerary wreaths. Right there, and so you got one of those at the head of each cenotaph or symbolic fake tomb. And then I just noticed this, very easy to overlook, but it's a boot scraper. And you can imagine, it's actually not even attached. So it's just kind of loosely sitting here. But it's made of iron, and of course would have been to scrape off your boots before going in and paying your respects to Marie Antoinette and whatnot. Ah, the sun. Once again, let's not miss it. So we start here with an elevated garden. You actually have to climb up two sets of stairs to get here. And that is a leftover, an inspiration from the Italian Renaissance to elevate a garden as you enter a religious space or a temple, as it were. There's a park that surrounds us, like a U-shaped park, all around here, beautiful with its own details, and I'm going to share that later on in the tour extension that I do for my Patreon subscribers. So my patrons can look forward to that private extension of this episode, and I'll show you all of what's around, but we're not there quite yet. Here we are. Let's get into the chapel itself, the Chapelle Expiatoire. I'll show you what's above us here. So again, rather modest Doric columns, nothing too flashy on the outside, which is typical of the neoclassical vibe from this period. I want to show you the color, quite a bit of colored marble in the floors, and it starts even before you enter here. And I believe we're going to be alone in the chapel. Let's take a look at the doors. I want to remind you, if you've got a good enough internet connection right now, you can watch this in 4K. I'm uploading it as such, recording it as such. So if you really want to get the most out of the quality of all these beautiful details, feel free to bump up the resolution of your replay here. Also, for those who are joining the premiere, I'll remind you that the super chat function is in effect. And if you want to support the cause, you can just click the little $ in the live chat to help out. So this is neoclassical architecture, inspired a lot by the Renaissance and Greco-Roman ideals. Here we've got the dome up top with a pretty classic Romanesque oculus. If you've ever been lucky enough to visit the Pantheon in Rome, it has a similar idea, of course bringing in that natural light with the oculus, and then we've got the beautiful decoration here in the dome itself. We'll talk more about all these carvings and these reliefs. But let's just take our time. We've got this place to ourselves. Like I said, this is not a top-tier tourist attraction, so when you come here, you're almost guaranteed to have a nice, quiet, peaceful, meditative experience. What's on either side of us before we move on? We've got some holy water basins on either side. Of course, fire extinguisher can come in handy. So yeah, again, there would have been just a slight indentation here for holy water, of course. And then beautiful candelabras all throughout the chapel. These candelabras were personally donated by Marie-Thérèse, again, the daughter of the royal couple that were executed. So it meant a lot. Clearly the daughter was planning to create a space that she could come and pray at to honor her family and her mom and dad. It's okay, it's okay. Yeah. Okay, I thought people were waiting for me. So another candelabra, you actually see a lot of candelabras here. And another holy water basin. So I talked about the colored marble, and of course we've got the dome up above us, and the marbled floor here is meant to mimic or play off of the idea of the circular dome. We have these triangular sections, 4 of them, and it was a way for architects to make the transition from a square-shaped ground floor and then having, of course, to transition it immediately up into a circular dome. And so that was geometrically a little bit tricky. And so that's what these triangular sections are for, and each one's dedicated to a certain religious component, which might be, for example, the Ten Commandments or the Passion of the Christ. Over on this side, I'm going to zoom in. This is, as you can see, for the 10 Commandments. Beautifully done. This is all, it was all completed in the mid-1820s. And if we pan down, you can see, hopefully you can see, just right here, there used to be 5 fleur-de-lis symbols, of course, the fleur-de-lis representing the Bourbon royal family and monarchs in general. And what happened was, even though the big French Revolution had already come and gone at this point, there were other smaller revolutions that came, at least a couple of them, 2 or 3. And they eventually came up here and they chiseled off all of the fleur-de-lis. Hopefully you can make that out. Well, all we've got is the leftovers. Interesting, they never, in modern times, never sought to repair that. But I'm going to stay zoomed in and just pan you over to one of the others, because it's the same underneath all 4 of those sections. Okay, there you can see the fleur-de-lis that were removed. In case you're wondering, those diamonds here are placed there for it's a treasure hunt for kids who come and visit, because understandably, this is not the most exciting spot for kids to hang out with their parents or grandparents. So there are diamonds around, and there's just a bit of a game treasure hunt that they can partake in. So in addition to giving the candelabras from her personal collection or her personal bank account, as it were, Marie-Thérèse, again, the daughter of Marie Antoinette, also paid for these 2 beautiful marble statues to be placed here. And I happen to love how the shadow of the crucifix hits the wall there. Absolutely perfect. And we're going to zoom in, of course, on these statues. The title of this is technically Marie Antoinette Sustained by Religion. I want you to take a look at a couple of things. First of all, the lace work here is absolutely formidable, I would say in French. And the folds of the fabric here on her arm and her torso, you can just follow them down. The fact that this was all carved out of a single block of marble is just always blows my mind. And then you've got her royal robe, as it were, and here you've got the fur of the robe that is very beautifully represented as well. You can really almost like reach out and touch the fur. And then of course the fleur-de-lis symbol. So this would have been her royal robe. You can see it's falling off her, it's sliding off her as she's reaching up towards the angel here. And that's interesting symbolism, because not only is the royal robe sliding off her, but you can see her crown as queen has fallen. And so clearly the symbolism there is that she is essentially shedding or losing all of her, she's being stripped of all of her queenly sort of ties, her royal ties. And it's essentially what's happening is she's being stripped of all of her mortal ties. And then also something I noticed, and this is just my own personal ponderings, she's got particularly long flowing hair here, if you see that. Absolutely glorious hair on Marie Antoinette. And it makes me think that on the day of her execution, when she was being carted to the guillotine, they chopped off all of her hair. And they said it was to not impede the blade of the guillotine and get a nice clean slice of the neck. But I imagine it must have also been to steal a bit of femininity from her and to demean her one last time. And so she was carted to the guillotine that day in 1793, completely shorn of her hair. So I wonder if later on the royal family, who wanted to honor her, if they intentionally made this hair almost exaggerated and very long and flowing and feminine, almost as a reaction or a retaliation for that. That's just my own theory. Just absolutely stunning. It's just one of those things you just want to look at from every angle. Oh, lest I forget, here at the base is the final letter that she wrote, in French, of course. And I just want to point out one thing here. She's writing to the sister of the king at the time, one of her closest confidants. And she says right here, it starts, and she's essentially saying, may my son never forget the words of his father before he was executed, and the words that I repeat to my son expressly, and that is, never seek vengeance for our death. And I gotta say, that's her keeping it pretty classy at the end. Before we get to the statue of Louis XVI, which is also a doozy, this is the main altar. Rather standard fare. A bit more colored marble here. And you step up onto the altar, and then up above you see this half circle shape. It mimics what's above, which is another half dome and half oculus. So that's not the main dome, but in fact, each of the altar and the two chapels with these statues we're looking at both have their own half dome with an oculus allowing natural light to illuminate. Here's our statue of King Louis XVI. And that's another stunner. This is Louis XVI called to immortality. And I love the X shape that you see here that it makes from this perspective. It's fantastic. This statue was by a well-known sculptor at the time named Bozio. Bozio had done a lot of other things in Paris, including one of my favorites, the Equestrian statue at Place des Victoires. I'll pull an image up here for you. This is a statue of Louis XIV, Place des Victoires. So same sculptor. And he did this out of one block of marble, including the wings of the angel and everything. I just love the expressive quality of this, the gestures. And his hand, his right hand up there, creates another great shadow. Look at all of that happening on his robe. Spectacular. And his last testament is also placed here. So this statue was done by Bozio. The statue of Marie Antoinette, I failed to mention earlier, was done by an even more well-known sculptor by the name of Cortot, C-O-R-T-O-T. Cortot did work on everything from Versailles to the Arc de Triomphe to notably the Place des Vosges statue of Louis XIII. I'll pull that up on the screen to give you an idea. So this same sculptor, Cortot, did this. And then also at Place des Vosges, the incredible fountains that I love so much, done by the same sculptor as this Marie Antoinette. So we've got two different sculptors for two different statues. We're not done yet. This is above the entrance that we came in, and I'll zoom in a little bit. This is a beautiful bas-relief, or a sort of low relief that's representing the transportation of the remains of Marie Antoinette and the king from this cemetery. Again, they had rested here for 21 years after their guillotine execution. They were being transported to St. Denis Basilica, where they reside today, and that's the royal necropolis of all the kings and queens of France. You can see that's the procession. And just above their heads there, it might be hard to make out, is a very shallow relief carved of the St. Denis Basilica, which you can still visit today just north of Paris and see the official tombs of these monarchs. And so you've got their remains there. And again, I'm going to zoom in again. You can see the crowns up top. See those crowns? And the two men who are carrying the remains are the two sons of the king at the time who was behind this, King Louis XVIII. One of them was a duke who happened to be the husband of Marie-Thérèse that we've been talking about. I don't know which one it would be, but I even wonder if this lady right here, who is covered right here and clearly in mourning, if that could be our own Marie-Thérèse, the daughter. So that's pretty powerful stuff. There was a time around here, again, there was the restoration of the royal family, and there was actually a hope and even an expectation that Louis XVI, who had been guillotined, would become canonized as another Catholic saint, a Christian saint, just like Saint Louis had been previously. Louis IX, King of France, was so religious and lived such a pious life that he was officially canonized by the church, and we call him Saint Louis ever since. So there was a belief that Louis XVI might enjoy a similar fate. And then what else can I show you from here? I have another image I want to share from the 1830s. I'm going to give you this view here. I'm going to put up a beautiful painting that was done of a mass being held here. And if you look, the mass is taking place, obviously, in this chapel, beautifully rendered. But at the front, there's a chair, and it's empty. And it was for Marie-Thérèse, who by this time in the 1830s, there had been another revolution, and she had been exiled again. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. They happen to hold a mass here every 21st of January because that's the date of the execution of Louis XVI. And so January 21st, not just here, but several churches around Paris, there are still today masses in honor of these the king and queen here. So we have staircases on either side behind both statues. And we're going to finish up by heading down into this underground section. Again, you'll notice There's been literally almost nobody here. I don't know if that's an expression, literally almost. Doesn't seem to make much sense as I say it, but gorgeous gates. So you can see that's in front of us, the staircase that would have been behind the statue of Marie Antoinette. You can take either one to get down here. Original floors. It's pretty modest down here, you'll see. There's nothing here except a niche. Could have perhaps been a statue or a precious object here originally. But on the other side, the highlight is an altar in honor of Louis XVI, but also marking the exact spot where his body was buried here after he was guillotined. Now, we're not too far from La Madeleine, as I mentioned, but also Place de la Concorde, and that's where these guillotine executions were happening for many, many months. And so there were over 500 guillotine victims that were transported from Place de la Concorde, the bodies and the heads, and all thrown together into mass graves here. But among them, as I said, the two most famous victims were Louis and Marie Antoinette. And this altar, if it can brighten up a little bit, you can see this altar represents the exact spot where his remains were found. And this is placed exactly under the altar that we saw upstairs, or I should say, the altar was placed exactly above the spot here where Louis was. And that makes sense. But for that reason, they had to go against the typical traditions of placing a church with the altar towards the east and the entrance towards the west, because this is actually on the western side, and there was a wall. He was buried against a wall. So they didn't have any choice but to put the altar here, and which was on the western side, which really went against the conventions of how you would typically orient a church, but that's all right. And we just got some insignias here. I've got a Sacred Heart. I understand originally there was always a chair placed down here for the daughter, Marie-Thérèse. And even though these aren't the same chairs, not from the same era, I always think of her when I come down here. The fact that there are still chairs here for those who want to pause and reflect and worship and pray. And she must have come here very often. That's a nice composition, love that. Take that photo. And what else do we have here? Over on this side, there's not too much. There's a niche where something may have been displayed, but it's gone. Over here, not too much going on. But, there on either side of the altar, same. That'll become more evident a little bit in a few moments when I talk about what happened to this chapel afterward. It was emptied. But look at here, we've got some treasures. These seem to be, and that's such a great composition. You could do that with a reflection. Or if you wanted to get cheeky, you could even sort of do something like that. Oh, I'm just having fun. But if we look closely here, these must have been funerary wreaths, perhaps even for the actual procession that took them from the cemetery to St. Denis Basilica. You can see it says 1793, which would have been the year of their executions. And Louis was guillotined in January, and then Marie Antoinette in October. So it represents the two dates of their executions with the fleur-de-lis. And clearly you can see it looks so old and embroidered that I can imagine like a wreath of flowers being placed in this netting. And there's a second one here with the same dates and a slightly different name in the center. And again, I don't know, you can make your own call, but to me these look old enough that they could have happened in the early 1800s when the official remains were moved. That's stunning. Okay. Now, if it seems a little cramped here, because this is the same surface area as above, which seemed very open and airy, it's because what they did was they took the remains, some of the other remains from the cemetery, a lot of those 500 victims of the guillotine that were tossed in with the royals, And they packed them all the remains into these walls and then just sealed them off forever. No door, no accessibility. And it was almost like King Louis XVIII, who was in charge, as I said, almost like he wanted to put the French Revolution behind him, which of course was extremely destructive to his family. That's to say the least. And so he just wanted to take all the remains and the other revolutionaries and whatnot and just pack them behind a wall and seal it off forevermore, almost like he's just trying his best to close the book on that and turn the page toward a new era that is more welcoming and accepting of the royal family. One reason I had to pre-record this episode is, as you can imagine, I get zero self-service down here, so a live version would not be possible. You can see another diamond up there for the kids. And we're going to finish up the public version of this walk with just one last room. We've been talking a lot about the daughter, Marie-Thérèse, and we've got a beautiful portrait painted of her here. The last room of the visit. Looking very elegant. Oh. I still would like to know, how the heck did these artists pull off these fabrics like this? I guess that's what they went to school for. Years and years and years slaving away in the classrooms trying to figure out how do you paint lace? How do you paint silk? How do you paint satin? How do you paint feathery plumage? How do you paint pearls? All that good stuff. Oh, what a great painting this is. So there was, again, another revolution in 1830 to remove another monarch, Charles X. And those revolutionaries chased out the royals once again. They emptied this chapel of all of its furniture, which is probably why some of those niches are bare. And the Duchess here, Marie-Thérèse, was exiled once again, never to return to Paris. And I can only assume that she felt great regret and sadness to no longer be able to come here to this chapel that she helped personally finance and decorate. And she would never be able to come back and pay her respects to her mom and dad. That must have been tough. So exiled not once, but twice from Paris. At one point, there were even plans to move her tomb here, and it would make sense to have her buried at this chapel. But no, it never happened for whatever reason. She's still buried in Slovenia, of all places. And then we'll just wrap up with some other details. This is one of the other ladies from the Revolution. She would have been buried here. She was famous for creating the rights of women, not the rights of man, but she was an early feminist fighting for the rights of women. Her name was Olympe de Gouges. And so she's one of the people that got snubbed, and she should have been mentioned when the cemetery was rehabilitated. So that's in women's history, that's a very big name. She fought for women's rights. Over here we've got such a beautiful milky white statue of Marie Antoinette. And I know we've got some reflections, but I saw on YouTube a video where they actually did the research to figure out what exactly she would have looked like for real, going off of her death mask and whatnot. And their conclusion was that she wasn't quite as pretty and quite as much of a looker as the artists would have you believe. But I guess that was par for the course, right? You always make people look a little bit more elegant, a little bit more sophisticated. And that's what you're paying for, I guess. Here we've got some frames of some royal family members. This is Madame Elizabeth. She was the sister of Louis XVI during the Revolution and tried to flee with them. This was the youngest boy. I mentioned he died in prison during the Revolution, so he never got to grow into an adult like his sister Marie-Thérèse. We call him Louis XVII sometimes, even though he was never technically a monarch here. And then this was the Duke, who happened to be the husband of Marie-Thérèse, that made her the Duchess of Angoulême. Look at this here. We've got an old confessional, beautiful red velvet seat, and they just embedded it into the closet here. Look at how nice that is. Old confessional. Now, what's hilarious is, look at this. It's like a little intercom or walkie-talkie that says confession. And I can't help but think about this funny idea of, like, you come here and there's no priest, so you just turn on this walkie-talkie and you're like, breaker, I've got a confession here, and we 10-4, Big Daddy, we're ready to receive you. Let us hear what's on your mind. Anyway, that's just my own odd imagination. Another document we've got from yet another revolution called the Commune in 1870. This was a decree that said that you can see right here, this is 1871, and they are very anti-monarchy as well. And they say here, the chapel that we are in right now is going to be destroyed, and all of the materials here are going to be sold at auction. And so clearly they also, in fact, had plans. So it's almost like every generation or two, someone came along and wanted to destroy this chapel, but miraculously it's still here. And we will finish up with a view of what they call the Lateral Gallery, this arcaded walkway that will take you to the gift shop, where they've got some pretty interesting books and posters and paraphernalia and whatnot. And then we've got historical panels that will give you, they're all in French, but they'll give you a little bit more backstory and some images as well. So there you have it, folks. Hope you enjoyed that. That is the Chapelle Expiatoire. And right now, immediately, I'm going to switch over to a tour extension for my patrons and a cafe chat. We'll go find a nice place to hang out and watch the world go by. And I'm also going to give my patrons some more info about the cemetery out here and show them details of the beautiful park, public park that surrounds this space, and the architecture as well, and you know, just some more juicy fun facts. That is going to happen live. This video was not live, pre-recorded, but just so you know, if you're a patron, head over to the link and we are going to be live for me to talk with you and see what you thought about this episode. So that's it, everybody. Thanks for joining me from the 8th arrondissement, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I will catch you on the next episode for another interesting address, I hope. Take care, all the best. I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.